Jay's Analysis is back, and at this time I've had several requests, several emails, a lot of comments, people actually wanting James Kelley to come back. I didn't actually want him to come back. No, I'm joking. No, it was one of the more enlightening, in-depth historical discussions that we had last time. If you recall, we talked about one of his papers discussing the zombie mass. So I'll go ahead and put a link up in this interview to that old interview as well, because you'll find that to be, I think, equally, hopefully, as interesting as this interview. This time we're going to be going in a different direction. We're going to discuss some thinkers that are probably not as well known to Jay's Analysis audience, or even in philosophical circles in general. We're going to talk about Paul Virilio and some of his work and what James has noticed there. And we're also going to talk some more about Dr. Joseph P. Farrell's works, where he sees Farrell going, stuff he's noticed of late, and then we'll talk about James's own writings and where you can find his books, where you can find his articles and scholarly essays. And James is, of course, an author. He has written several books on Orthodox theology. He's known as well for Anatomizing Divinity, which is his book through Trine Day Publishers. James has studied, if I recall, you've studied quite a bit on the history of philosophy. I'm sorry, philosophy of science, and the intersect sort of between religion and science. That's right? Isn't that correct, James?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Yeah, and that was at University of Oklahoma. So we want to welcome James back. What's been on your mind lately, James?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Jay, for having me back. Last two interviews were great. Some of my favorite moments, promoting and talking about my work has been on Jay's Analysis. So this will be the third one. So what I'm thinking about lately is I tried for several years to try to relate my perspective to what's commonly known as critical theory. And, some of the big names would be like Jean Baudrillard and Gilles Deleuze, people that you've definitely read some of, but a lot of people may not have. And the thing about this tradition of thought is that it's also called cultural theory, broadly speaking,
right,
is that there tends to be a kind of anti-religious bias to a lot of these thinkers. So it tends to be that a lot of theologians don't really talk about critical theory that much.
Right.
Because critical theorists tend to be interested in structuralism and post-structuralism and just saying, well, there's really nothing beyond the signifier or a system of signs. So individual actors and meta-narratives and let alone theological motives are not really talked about that much.
Sure, yeah, metaphysics is dead, so right.
Yeah, and of course, having said that, of course, the counterpoint would be, well, with thinkers coming up like Slavoj Žižek and Alain Badiou, they say that they are not theists, but they kind of use a lot of German idealistic philosophy as a basis for their thinking.
They do. I had to read some Badiou and some Chantal Mouffe. I guess Mouffe. I don't know exactly how you pronounce it, but sort of in that same vein of on the political. It is Mouffe's work, but as you point out, it borrows so much from a lot of older metaphysical ideas, and at least that kind of approach, and definitely with Zizek, we see that borrowing as well.
Sure, and even one of the big examples of how theology sort of comes in to an extent, but in a really bizarre way, in critical theory, is one of Badiou's star students, Quentin Meillassoux is his name. He wrote a book called After Finitude. And it was translated into English and was a big deal. Meillassoux basically says, look, he's trying to move past physicalism versus theism. He's basically saying that there is a middle way. And the way that he points it out is he says that there are four positions Meillassoux thinks that you can take about God. He says, the first one is, I believe in God because he exists, and that would be yourself, myself, and that's pretty self-explanatory. He said the second position would be, I don't believe in God because he doesn't exist. He says that would be like Daniel Dennett, people that make outrageous claims that they can know that there's nothing beyond the material.
Right.
And so that's that. The third one, he said, would be a kind of Luciferianism, where it's like, I believe in God, but because there's the Holocaust and evil in the world, I'm going to just flout him just as a kind of fit of pique, and I'm just going to say I don't believe in him, therefore God doesn't exist. He said, but the fourth position, he said, would be, no, it's okay that there was a Holocaust, it's okay that there's evil, because God doesn't exist yet. He said it's the ultimate self-consistent position about evolution, because he says the basic rules of nature have changed several times. He said, for one thing, there was a creation from nothing. Next, there was the emergence of life from non-life. Mm-hmm. And then third, there was the emergence of thought from life. He said, and the next thing, who's to say that there can't be the emergence of the uncreated from the created?
Sure, Deus ex machina, and we've got the idea of the emergent deity, which is kind of an older Gnostic idea, the immanent emergent deity that arises from within the created realm.
Yeah, and Meillassoux also believes that Descartes was right. He's in this sense. Meillassoux says we can know mathematically absolute truth. He said, but since God hasn't been born yet, it's not figured into the equation. So he can believe that we can know the laws of nature mathematically. I call it like mathematicism. It's like science. Science is what we all should be looking toward, but it's the mathematical basis of science. It's really science.
Yeah, I heard an interview with Ray Kurzweil, the transhumanist, recently, where he was saying essentially that same thing, that his view is not necessarily that there is no God, but more so that essentially what all the religious traditions, the perennial tradition, etc., what it's pointing to is the potentiality for an emergent deity of some sort in the near future. And of course, as you pointed out, that kind of makes sense with the flux evolutionary perspective.
And you can tell where Meillassoux probably fits some of the overall structure of his ideas, because his teacher Badiou basically says, look, we can know what the laws of nature are at any given time, but there's always the potentiality of the event, capital E, to burst in from the outside. And when you look at what Badiou says about that, he says, well, basically, what we have is we can understand reality mathematically, but there's this nothingness that precedes it, and this nothingness that follows it. So he says that we always have to realize that the laws of nature can change at any time, and then we can know those too.
Yeah, sort of a Humean skepticism that's interjected into this matrix of anti-metaphysical metaphysics, it seems.
Absolutely, and if you look at Farrell's very cogent analysis of the dialectic of oppositions, it can be caricatured to just take some of Farrell's ideas and then apply them to everything. But one way that it does seem to work is that you have not only particular ideas that call forth their opposites, and they're both extremes and neither one of them. But you also have, in critical theory, this idea that you can split the difference between two ideas, and it can be a move forward. So that's
which is essentially Hegelian, ultimately. But yeah, you're right.
Sure.
Hegel or Farrell talked about that as well. You're right.
Absolutely. Is that there are a lot of different. I think the main thing about Farrell's dialectic of oppositions is that it's one of those ideas. It's so general that it can get lost if you don't anchor it in some kind of a historical development. And what he does in his theological work, of course, is that he puts it forth as a systematic historical account of theological development. Mm-hmm. But what Farrell's doing now, here I've jumped from critical theory to Farrell, but hey, we got to follow it where it goes, I guess.
Sure, that's fine.
But what Farrell's doing now is he's backed away from what he calls churchianity. Mm-hmm. He's backed away from any kind of allegiance to any Christian church, and really to Christianity. And so what he's trying to do now is he's made this wonderful 800-page case for his theological perspective, and now he's taking one of those perspectives, one of those Gnostic perspectives, and he's saying, this is what we're going to do, because monotheistic traditions are mean, and they make you choose between different sets of revelatory truths, and that since there's no need to choose between those, and it leads to, allegedly leads to violence, then that's something we should be suspicious of. We all know this argument.
Yeah,
But,
and I would just interject. I mean, in my mind, though, that's sort of inescapable. I mean, any position that you take that's a worldview of any kind, whether it's, rationalism or scientism or agnosticism or some sort of pragmatism, you name it, you're still going to, I think, be presented with the fundamental questions of what's the ultimate source of authority for this belief? Where does this truth with a capital T derive from, if you believe in truth with a capital T? I mean, in other words, that's an inescapable, I think, question. So just because religion or this religion or that religion presents a revelatory basis, even if you locate the fulcrum of your worldview in, say, your own reason or your own existential experience or some sort of Platonism or something like that, the questions haven't changed. It's just the source of the authority has moved. I mean, in other words, it's still incumbent upon you as an individual to, believe that what you have discovered is at least revelatory or true. I mean, do you see what I'm saying?
Oh, sure. And looking at his work now, I totally am with you on that, because if you think about it, his position now, if just to summarize it, Dr. Farrell sent me a book of his own notes that he's taken from, I think, 1987 to 2001. He made a book out of it, and I don't know if he's ever has this for sale online now or not. I haven't checked, but he sent me a copy of this book. And let's see, what's the title of it? Notes Toward the Foundations of the Formal Principles of Intercontextual Analysis is what he calls it. Mm-hmm. And so in this text, he basically speculates. He says, well, so what, if there is any part of this religious analysis that I did of the dialectic of opposition, what part of it can I retain now that I no longer adhere to Eastern Orthodoxy? And what he says is, in one part of the book, he says, perhaps the Christian traditions, preeminently Eastern Orthodoxy, are sort of temporary hangout positions where certain tendencies that were against extreme revolutionary types of ideologies, extreme kinds of nihilistic thinking, or the kinds of thinking he's against. Maybe these religions were hangout positions where the secret wisdom of what he calls the topological metaphor actually are there, and the different individuals are cognizant of different, parts of it. But that what it does is it leaves the question, though, of what the real meaning of it is. Because if you get back to what he thinks the topological metaphor is, it's just simply the fact that everything that exists has a structure of beginning, middle, and end, or what he calls, alpha, mesotis, and telos.
Yes, that's actually, I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm glad you've gotten to that, because I had in my notes that I wanted to get to that topic, because that's actually been on my mind recently, and I finally got around to getting hold of and reading that appendix in the Giza work where he discusses the topological metaphor. And I wanted to ask you if you thought that I was correct, in that what I basically get from this is that sort of the Platonic ideas of, say, or more so maybe a Pythagorean notion of this fundamental structure or fabric of reality, say in an original triad or something like that, that it actually has, that the religious mysteries are essentially across the board sort of touching on that same unifying triadic structure, and that triadic structure should not be, say, hypostatized into a personalized, externally existent, objective being, but rather that they sort of represent, like you said, topological principles, or sort of inherent mathematical principles or geometric principles that apply to the planes of existence, if you will. Is that sort of the right analysis of this? Because we probably have a lot of readers who aren't familiar with the topological metaphor. So is that correct?
I think so, because I think what you have with the topological metaphor is he's basically saying that if you go above and beyond and prior to everything that actually exists, you don't reach absolute simplicity. You don't reach, what the pre-Socratics called an apeiron, the thing that you cannot run across because it's so huge, and the thing that has every potentiality in it but nothing's manifest. He said you always have this three-part structure, which corresponds to the way that we always have a beginning. We go through an experiential process, and then we have an end, or a telos. So he says that false analyses are always going to say that they're going back to some kind of foundational, radically simple origin that goes past the topological metaphor. And what's interesting as a sidebar is that you might think, okay, well, I don't buy this, that's fine, but what does he do with it? And I think that in his books, what he seems to be doing with it lately is he says, okay, well, what happens is just these mathematical, entities just spring out like little trees, like little evolutionary trees from the highest thing, which is the topological metaphor, the original, capital T, capital M. And all these other little entities spring out from it, these little genetic or just mathematical entities, which become more complex. And what happens when you have, things that happen in society like conspiracies and elite groups that are looking for some kind of ancient bloodline and some kind of ancient wisdom is that they are looking for tablets of destiny or other artifacts that were made by beings that are higher up in the topological chain, and they're trying to use that power because since it has more little mini metaphors, below it in the tree, it's able to, grasp more power and have more control over anything that's underneath it. So it's almost like you have eugenicist type, groups who are like, well, if I can get a hold of this artifact,
like
the
the story of, say, Hitler with the spear of destiny, which, so I've read, has some truth to it. That the idea of, if I can get a hold of this, mythical principle, mythical object, or if we can somehow encapsulate through CERN, the higher dimensional physics, or if I can, get to the lowest level of subatomic reality, I can, achieve 0-point gravity or some sort of, etheric Tesla powers, something like that. In other words, it all sort of stems from this desire to go beyond the present and tap into some sort of original perennial unity, or some. In other words, that in the Platonic scheme of, say, the division or the splitting from the one, you're saying that there's this fractal sort of multiplicity that's come from it.
Yes, absolutely. And people that are the movers and shakers, according to Farrell, are people who realize that if you can put yourself in a certain place and you can acquire a certain object, then you potentially are able to sort of invisibly control things.
Now,
so it's interesting how it fits in with conspiracy-oriented thinking. It's definitely interesting that not very many people give that sophisticated of a metaphysical background for their theorizing. So
I agree, and for those that may be skeptical or think that that's too far out, I would argue that you are probably at this moment listening to this on a computer using YouTube or Google or whatever, or on your iPhone. And if you think about an iPhone, it is a small encapsulated sort of magical mirror, as James and I have talked in the past about the magical mirror, or the seeing peepstone of Dr. John Dee. But essentially that mythological idea is localized in something as common now as an iPhone, which would have seemed magical, 100 years ago. So the idea is very much true, whether or not you agree with all of Farrell's views, or whether or not you think that some of this is too far-fetched. I mean, the basic principle that we're discussing here, I think, is true.
Absolutely, and I still believe that his theological work is valuable, for historical analysis. It has brought up a lot of questions about, for instance, if you are a Catholic, how do you use Teilhard de Chardin's work? I mean, the fact that if you read his private papers, and he's got a lot of weird fascist ideas and a lot of stuff that does not fit with Christianity at all, you know, if you're a Roman Catholic, then do you have to look for the imprimatur, and if you don't find it, don't cite his work?
Right, and I mean, if I recall, John the 23rd or Paul the 6th removed him from the band, so the idea that within the span of a few decades, Deschardins' work could be unorthodox and then orthodox, I think, is a great on-the-ground pragmatic example of many of the many problems in the Roman Catholic system.
Oh, sure. And another way that I've sort of had to justify to myself and to a lot of people that you can imagine are wondering why that I would want to write about somebody who has renounced Eastern Orthodoxy, and I tend to have an Orthodox perspective. Well, the thing I say to them is, well, for one thing, you know, we have no idea what the end of this story is. I mean, in one of his private talks on his website for members only, someone asked him who he thought spiritual heroes were, and he said they would all be Eastern Orthodox saints. But he said, I don't want to get into that because that's going to cause more problems and confusion than it's going to solve. So I do think that there's a kind of, you know, we like to look at thinkers and people that we admire and like to think, well, everything's always got to add up to a coherent whole at every time. But what really happens in life a lot is that people get disenchanted with organizations, they get disenchanted with individuals in certain groups, and even though their beliefs haven't changed, they will tweak their beliefs to try to make their life make sense so that they can go on moving forward.
Sure, it's happened to me as personally, so I wouldn't fault anyone for changing their mind on a different position. Could we rewind just for a second, though, because I had a question just for me personally. I wanted to make sure that I understand, because some of the aspects of the chapter on the topological metaphor are a little bit obtuse. I think I grasped about 75 to 80% of it, but one thing I'm a little unclear about that you may be able to answer is the metaphor that he's discussing essentially just the beginning, middle, end in the same sort of way that Augustine talks about that version of a triadic structure existing in reality, or is it also? I mean, is it also the same idea as the monad, dyad, triad? Are those essentially the linked ideas?
Yes, they're linked ideas because in that chapter you're talking about in Giza, Death Star Destroyed, and then also in the privately published book that I mentioned previously, he talks about the beginning, middle, end as being one aspect of it, but another type of triad that's sort of asymmetrically smushed in there with that, I think, is this idea that you have an initial unity,
right,
and then you also have this particular system is pulsed either by itself or automatically, and that this pulsing of this original system, which is ironically radically simple apeiron, becomes diform. It becomes this is me and this is the part of myself that I created this other, and then of course I've inadvertently created a surface between two different regions of this unbounded nature. Which,
by the way, I don't know if you've ever seen the quote from Werner Heisenberg, which I've cited a few times in a couple of articles, where he says that at the subatomic level, what is demonstrated is not matter, but actually, quote, Platonic forms, geometric Platonic forms, and those forms take these same types of structure. Right.
Yeah, I have seen that quotation. And and Farrell's very interested in Heisenberg. He's definitely cited him in a lot of his work.
Well,
not at any great depth, but
I say that because we probably have people that'll be listening to this who are of more of a skeptical bent, who will say, well, what are you even talking about? How does that even apply to anything quote scientific? Well, if quantum physics is scientific, and I think most people think so, Certainly, there's a lot of New Age gobbledygook that's wrapped up in it. But for the movers and shakers, the lights of quantum physics, and somebody like, say, Wolfgang Pauli or Werner Heisenberg, they're very adamant, very candid about their belief that at that level of reality, you actually see that sort of substrate fabric of reality, explicates or demonstrates these same forms, these geometric forms, or even archetypal forms, if you will.
Sure, and in Farrell's work, you've got, the newer works, you've got various attempts to kind of put some neutral content in those three phases, the original moment, the other, and then the sort of surface.
Okay.
And I feel that at times he's having to do the impossible because he's not wanting to agree to any kind of revelatory, position whatsoever. But he's also trying to say this is just the mathematical structure of reality here, and so he's not wanting to put any kind of content to it that ties it to any kind of religious belief or anything. So I think that it's interesting, if for no other reason than to see someone try to remain self-consistent while doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And he does as well as probably anyone could. But I'll always say you should read any of Farrell's books, but I think that the best standing criticism of anything he's written lately is his earlier work. The analysis of signs, of semiotics, and the analysis of Gnosticism that he does in his early work is, comes to bear on some of the things that he comes up with, especially his criticism of so-called monotheism, based on a lot of the research of Jan Osman and people like that. So I think that it's kind of a weak analysis of orthodoxy, but obviously I'm going to think that because I believe in orthodoxy. So
yeah.
for those who are into Jan Osman and the kind of idea that anti-Yahwism or whatever you want to call it, he does an okay job of putting that position forward. But I think that if you read his early work, there's some devastating critiques of it. But that's why people have to get into these books and find out for themselves.
Right. Well, so if you were going to put the where Farrell is presently in some sort of tag or title, would it be accurate to say it's more of a perennialism in the sense of Ganon and Kumaraswamy or any of those guys, or is it more of a classic Pythagorean Platonism, or is it just not really classifiable?
Really, in a way, he's kind of close to the modern critical theorist, mathematicist critical theorist, even though he does not come from that background at all. He got his ideas about set theory and about mathematics and science from reading kind of the classics of early 20th century science, Einstein and Heisenberg and von Neumann and all these kinds of people. And then he also read Syntactical Structures by Noam Chomsky, which just kind of, and he read the basic text about set theory, and so he kind of looked at other cultural meta-narratives early on in his thinking in a structuralist kind of way. And so he was always trying to make all this fit together. And while he was Orthodox, he really had a great balance of them all.
Right.
One thing I will say about his work is that he never claimed to teach people like practical Orthodox spirituality. He did that in his own pastoral life as an Orthodox bishop and priest. But in his work, he was more interested in the correct formulation of Orthodox dogmatics and then also a historical critique of the West. So he will tell you, he's like, I don't want to comment much about the Desert Fathers. So it's an interesting commentary on a lot of, you see this dichotomy in a lot of Catholic theology and Orthodox theology where people will either be the guys that teach you this is how you pray and this is how you get through life. Then you have the other people that seem to be saying this is what the term hypostasis indicates and this is what it doesn't indicate. So I find that that's kind of an obstacle for a lot of people who are trying to become Orthodox. They're like, where does all this, where do all these complicated theological terms come from? And then you've got these other people who are saying, here's how you go through your day, and here's how you live.
Yeah.
But so that's something that I do get a lot from people inside and outside the boundaries of churchianity.
Well, I definitely think that what's fascinating is that if you go the route, say, of present situation, Pharrell, I think you really are sort of getting on the borders of the most advanced, the deepest sort of technology that's out there. Because I think if you look at the guys that do AI and stuff like that, and sort of the cutting edge AI stuff, you're looking at dealing with set theory and Gödelian loops and things like that. So I think that the secrets of nature is really what you end up plumbing, and there are a lot of depths to plumb there, and there are a lot of secrets in nature that DARPA basically works on, sort of the how to tease out of nature itself, technology that can go beyond nature, if you will. And I think that what Pharrell's getting at is sort of this, what you find in the trivium or the quadrivium and stuff like that. That's actually the structure of reality itself. So I think that that's all invaluable. I mean, in other words, that's all true. You know what I mean? Do you see what I'm saying? It's not. I mean, I know that you're more interested in discussing Pharrell's views on this or that, but I'm saying I think that all of that stuff is actually accurate about the world. Whether or not that's the totality explanation for deity or divinity, I would still disagree. But when it comes to understanding the natural world, that really seems to kind of be the secret, if you will.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Yeah, and I do think so. I think that any time that you look at what people are thinking out there, there's not any people have told me that I have to do this, but there's not any reason to just reject something outright because a certain frame of reference doesn't jive with your theological beliefs. I guess it's just a unique case, because I remember when I first was received into Orthodoxy, I never heard anyone tell me any stories or any anecdotes about people leaving Orthodoxy. But it's funny that after I was in it for many years, I realized that it does happen. And it's funny. It's kind of like people who are waiting on Hume's deathbed, standing by, saying he's gonna quit being an atheist any minute after he's about to die. Mm-hmm. It's funny how you get the same kind of thing where it's like you see people that kind of buck heads with church authorities and seem to be getting further and further outside of comfortable Eastern Orthodoxy, and you think, well, surely they can't leave, so they only have these choices, and sure enough, they leave. And it's kind of traumatic for the believer, when that happens. But then you learn a lot from it, and you realize that, golly, I shouldn't have been sitting by Hume's bedside. Well, who's to say that he's going to do this, and who's to say that this person is going to believe the same thing in day number 2 than they did day number 1?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of been a growing, maturing process. And then plus, the fact that I did not listen to the people that told me that I should not write about this person. This person, while he was in Orthodoxy, he was always, a rebel. He was always doing things the church authorities didn't like. He was always a suspicious character, and so he should just very well be forgotten. And I don't think that's the case, because I think his theological work is valuable. Yeah. And I'm interested in what happens when people, and I don't want to sound like I don't have any personal interest in him. He's my very good friend. But I'm interested in the way people construct their positions when there doesn't seem to be any position they can take. I find it interesting.
That's a good point.
They can feel off. Yeah, he offers, like you said, a lot of things of great value, or I wouldn't be writing about him,
Well, hold on just one second, if you would. Here, I want to discuss more about what you think. I mean, do you personally think that? I mean, I know from what you've written in Anatomizing Divinity that a lot of the esoteric stuff that we've seen in the history of the West was essentially this. How can we state it? Locating of the Augustinian shield onto this plane of reality. So looking for the little trinities in nature and so forth. Which excellent stuff that you covered in that book. I want to know if you have any more thoughts on that. I mean, do you think that that's essentially where the deep science of the West and sort of the amazing technological advances that we've had in the West, do you think that that's really the direction that they've gone? In other words, I've written a bunch of articles, a lot of which have sprung from your ideas, from Pharrell's ideas. That's kind of a key to understanding, even though we may not like all of the technocratic tyranny or the crazy advances of the NSA or anything like that. We may not like those things. Nevertheless, the discoveries and this hidden tech, if you will, I don't mean to get too esoteric, but it really does seem to be based on an alternate version of metaphysics. So I've done some talks and some articles about not alternative metaphysics in some sort of new age way, but that rather that contrary to the educational system, as we're told in mainline academia and so forth, that nature out there in the world is just this chaotic flux of never changing chemical reactions, but rather that it has a very finely tuned structure to it. So do you agree with that? I want to know what your thoughts are on all of this, because you traced the history of Western technology and Western development and Western Hermeticism very well. But I want to know what you think about where it's going. Do you agree, say, with some of the ideas that Pharrell presents in his book on transhumanism or something like that? Do you see that as hinting at what I'm saying, that there really is an alternative version of physics and metaphysics that is real, and yet what Pharrell talks about, what does he call it, mass consumption physics?
Yeah, I do think that what you've got going on is that Paul Virilio said one thing. He said, just because we can do it doesn't mean we know what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that what happens is, as you mentioned before in our conversations, is that we come up with these scientific models for how to do things, and they're intimately related to technological advances and to industrially produced technology. So that we say, oh, okay, well, this will work. So let's create theory, and then let's kind of interweave it with practice. And if they kind of mesh together at all, the emphasis is on what's the next thing that we can do. Mm-hmm. To me, as far as if you look at the difference between what the Academy says is science, and then kind of like you said, the alternative science. I think there is kind of a duality there, because there are kind of, in the Academy science, whenever it comes to one of these sticky issues, they're just going to say, well, at the end of the day, the spaceship flies. So,
yeah.
We're more interested in research programs than philosophy of science.
Right.
So if you bother my research scientists about philosophy of science too much, I'll have to ask you to leave. That's kind of the idea, because they need to be working. So it's driven by factors that are way larger than just
than
research program or whatever.
Than armchair philosophizing about is this metaphysical principle true? It's about results.
It is about results, but I mean, as far as if you look at what the alternative science theories are saying, and then what the Academy science is saying, yes, there are going to be tensions there, and then the alternative views seem to answer certain questions better,
Well, yeah. Yeah.
So beyond that, as far as like what I think the direction is in science is, I think that we're moving more definitely towards transhumanism. There's no doubt about that. We're moving more, I think, towards screens. Everything is going to be on a screen. You know, computers used to be, you know, like Hewlett-Packard typewriters with a screen on it. But now they've done away with everything but, you know, microchips and screens. And not only that, but they're coming up with, you know, the Google goggles and the other things that basically are like, well, let's just go ahead and, you know, let's go ahead and suffuse your whole perceptual field with a screen.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So I think the next screens are going to be brain chips. The next screens are going to be things that sit over your eyes.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah. That's interesting because that, in fact, will bring about a lot more immobility, a lot more stationary sitting, a lot more staring. And let's get into Virilio, because you've talked in the past, you and I have had conversations in the past, I think it was about movement, and you had a really, really fascinating series of comments about the progression of man's movement. You know, if we think back 1,000 years, you know, movement might entail your clan or your tribe moving from one region to another over a span of several months or years, and then, you know, we have the rise of trains, the rise of cars, so forth, to you know, high-speed travel, so forth. So movement itself is a very fascinating, ignored subject. So tell us some of what you think about Virilio and his ideas about movement, and maybe even how that might relate to the fact that we're moving towards immobility and people just sort of being big fat slobs on their couch staring at screens.
Exactly, yeah. Paul Virilio, his main overarching theme, or his main overarching concept, is what he calls speed. And what he means by speed is the psychological, socio-political, and ultimately spiritual effect of the displacement of bodies. And he always looks at it from the perspective of, we have to start with the perceiver. He was a student of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and he also was a big fan of the Gestalt psychologist against the behavioralist. So he's like, well, basically, we can talk about the world out there, but it always has to be from the perspective of an observer who is related to a ground and is related to forms that emerge from it.
Correct.
So
yeah.
Well, kind of got this. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, well, I did have to do in one of my grad phenomenology class, we read Merleau-Ponty's analysis of body and placement in terms of phenomenology perception. So that's really, really fascinating stuff. So definitely go ahead.
And the great thing about, I think, Virilio is that he starts from a perspective of phenomenology, but it's not like Husserl. It's not like Heidegger. It's not bogged down, from my perspective anyway, it's not bogged down in abstraction upon abstraction upon
technicalities,
abstraction. Right. And some kind of pretension to, you know, absolute truth, which Husserl seemed to have gotten the bug of, I'm going to teach scientists, you know, their presupposition.
Right, exactly.
I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think that it didn't work out for Husserl. It came to grief. And what Virilio does, though, is he says, look, if we want to look at the history of mankind and where we got to the point that we are right now with Google goggles and so on, then we have to look at we have to do a little thought experiment and say, how did this possibly start? And he said, well, everything starts with man, the embryo, in the womb of a woman. He said, man begins as the passenger of the woman. Then, when he's out in the world, as a hunter in a tribe or a band in a primitive society, he has to hunt the animal and he has to mimic its movements in order to have a successful hunt. So he talks about the sphinx-like feline movements of prey, how they go from being stationary to a state of motility seemingly instantaneously, and it allows them to survive. And when the hunter mimics this behavior in order to pursue the prey, he gets a rush of emotion, a rush of adrenaline, and his duration, to use the Bergsonian term, changes. His speed changes. And he's sometimes able to be successful as a hunter. So what happens is, according to Virilio, is he says that there's the relationship to the woman becomes, she's going to become my passenger so that I can move movement. So he makes a kind of intellectual move where he says, this defines the sexual role of the man and the woman in a tribal society.
Interesting.
So that she's subjected to him sexually. And this becomes a metaphor for how he relates to the horse,
which is not a bad thing.
He actually makes some kind of, off-color puns, and I think, this will happen. There's some parental advisories probably that should be put on the cover of some of these French critical theory books, but we know about that. Right. Stand-up philosophy, that kind of thing. But anyway, he says, that this whole idea that, there are these Sphinx-like, what does the Sphinx do? The Sphinx said, okay, you walk past me in Oedipus Rex. Well, I'm just going to throw a riddle at you, and if you make a mistake, there's going to be a sudden movement of destruction that's going to be your annihilation. Mm-hmm. Well, what's the riddle? What it has, starts off on 4 legs, goes to 2, and then ends up on 3. And the answer is man. Man is the being that, in response to his own corruption, moves up from being 4-legged, which is an animal, to human being, standing on 2 legs, and then creates a prosthesis, in this case a cane. But he's the one who uses technical objects in order to extend, his finitude.
Exactly.
So this is what he's saying, that, and it's all in the context of this strange zoophilia, he calls it, where there's someone, you fall in love with the speed of the pursued animal. You incorporate it into your own tactics, if you will, your own logistics of the hunt. And then not only that, but you take it to the domestic sphere and you say, you're going to be my pack animal and bring my supplies along with me. And not only that, but we're going to extend this dual kind of, man and beast on one hand and then man and the woman on the other. Well, there's a third kind of relationship here, because you're going to say there's the mount. And he uses the French word, there's a pun there on the animal that you ride, and then also to see is the same word in French. So he's saying once you're able to movement, you have that, animal motility, but you say, not only am I going to incorporate that into my own hunting technique, but I'm going to movement by creating the mount, which is a metabolic vehicle which allows me to actually change the mode of my perception. Because when someone's riding a vehicle, then the things that are actually stationary appear to be moving, and the things that are moving appear to be stationary, the seat on the back of the horse, saddle, or being in the chamber of the moving vehicle. So he is interested in this kind of more shoot-from-the-hip kind of phenomenology. It's really just kind of common sense, but with some really insightful, points. So he moves on from there, though, and he says, look, we can all bring this back to the psychological level and to say that the condition of the conscious human being is not what Freud says. There is an unconscious, but our consciousness is structured by a thing he calls pycnolepsy. It's kind of like a mini epilepsy that he says every fallen human being is subject to. And he says that it's called the tiny death. Epilepsy is the little death. The big death, we all know what that is. It's the end. But the tiny death is pycnolepsy, from the Greek pyknos, which means frequent. And he's saying basically any time that we perceive the outside world, it's patterned on a 2-stage process. You have a perception of what you see around you. We all know what that is. But then there are these imperceptible cuts in the soundtrack where you are perceiving, but the screen is turned off. You have the blue screen of death, as a computer geek would say. But it's alternating so quickly that you can't sense it. And what he says is that this can generate a kind of euphoria at your own state of being shut off from the world, and that this can people who are doing the wrong things in life, people that are basically not trying to be ascetic, not trying to relate to the other in a non-dominating way. These people are going to become kind of intoxicated and addicted to speed, as he says. I think with a little bit of tongue in cheek, but. So, I mean, as far as does this theory hold water, well, he uses some anecdotal evidence for it. I'm not so sure, but my interest in it was, wow, this really syncs up, this pycnolepsy syncs up nicely with the Orthodox view of the way that the mind works, where you have the heartbeat and you have logismoi, or thoughts, which the mind naturally produces, and if you don't structure, your consciousness on these, then you're letting a non-polemic, non-will-based part of yourself sort of control you. And you will end up doing things that you didn't want to do.
Yeah. So
I found that
essentially back to say where Father Robonides talks about being determined by nature rather than the will, properly functioning to control the passions. Essentially, so is that what you're saying here? Getting to the darkened noose.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the interesting thing is that Aurelio kind of cops onto this a little bit because he's not a doctrinaire Augustinian. He's not someone that, he actually criticizes Augustine a little bit, although he doesn't see it as being a really big point to him. He's more interested in cultural analysis. But, Aurelio is trying to say that he's not sure about, he actually says at one point the Pope needs to outlaw just war. He needs to take that off the books because there's no such thing. So I think that, and that's no unusual thing for a Catholic to say. I'm not going to do what the Pope says. I mean, that's pretty, that's not any kind of idiosyncrasy that's out there all over the place. But I find it interesting that the more that a Catholic becomes a public intellectual who doesn't really care about scholasticism and doesn't really care about Aquinas or whatever, the more he seems to kind of fall into something I can agree with.
Yeah, well, that was probably more so true decades ago. I mean, the Roman system has really sort of degenerated into believe anything you want nowadays. So it's kind of kind of a free for all now. But I'm sure decades ago that was a lot more serious business.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's one of the reasons. And I'm not picking on Catholics. I mean, there are tons of Orthodox thinkers that I'm like, well, that's totally wrong. Mm-hmm. And if there was some kind of tribunal or some imprimatur that Orthodox thinkers needed, then this book wouldn't get it. Mm-hmm. So that's certainly not nitpicking. But I guess I'm just saying that I really do like the way that he takes a form of consciousness, which he says this explains how technology comes about. The individual seeks to be actually outside the body, because they seek absolute security from any kind of security threat. In the primitive society, it would be the beast or the man that's trying to hunt you. So therefore, you have to become a logician and say that I'm going to use the motor hidden behind the meat on the hoof, is what Aurelio says. I'm going to use my imagination to say I'm going to use this horse. Getting that sort of passenger kind of metaphor very deep within the subconscious, probably from your own origin. You're wanting to deny, the embryonic origin.
It makes me think of 2001: A Space Odyssey, where in the beginning the apes. I don't buy into the ancient Darwinian aeonic mythos, but at least as it's presented in the film, you have at the beginning the apes utilizing technology for weaponry. So one ape discovers that he can take that bone or shin or whatever and conk the other one over the head and kill it. And then the other apes decide, well, we need to have weaponry as well. So warfare is intimately tied into that predator-prey.
Oh, absolutely.
And then as you pointed out, the narrative of 2001 presents the progress of man precisely about in regards to getting outside of bodily limitations. That's the whole point of the final scene in the Victorian setting, where the old man dies, still subjected to his finitude and bodily limitations, and becomes Starchild. So that's absolutely the mythology presented in 2001.
Sure, and remember the ape, once he realizes the force, once he feels the bodily effects of utilizing the tool, then he falls in love, Aurelio probably would say, with his own motility. He falls in love with the way that it feels to use the weapon. And don't forget, Sun Tzu said a sword is a thing of ill omen. It's obscene. Mm-hmm. And so he takes the phallic femur bone, and he's going to town with it. He's showering sparks all around him. Presaging the fact that you'll be able to create fire, and that's all these other hidden technologies that are in that.
Yeah, and that's extension. That's, by the way, is I think the meaning of the monolith. I didn't mean to go all off into a 2001 thing, but the monolith appears at that point, and that's at every major stage, supposedly, in man's evolutionary development. In the narrative, the monolith appears, and so it sort of represents the other. It's the unknown, other that appears, representational, I think, of any kind of deity or beyond. And this grasping for the beyond is precisely what the humans are after, right? So, they go to Jupiter, beyond Jupiter, so forth. They go to the moon. They go into the black hole, going after this other. And that other is the very thing that you're talking about.
Oh, I'm right there with you, and I think it's even more on point, because I think that the monolith is a screen.